In this video, I'll explain how to cancel a real estate transaction in the state of California. It's a full primer, everything that you need to know on how to cancel a real estate transaction in California, whether you're a buyer or a seller. I'll start with a buyer. Now, a buyer has a much easier time getting out of a real estate transaction than a seller because a buyer has contingency periods that are built into the contract, namely the loan contingency, the appraisal contingency, and finally the inspection or investigation contingency. And that period is typically 17 days. Of course, it can be modified. And in that time, for basically any reason, a buyer can decide that they don't want to proceed. They can back out. They send a CC form, which stands for cancellation of contract, to the seller, and their earnest money deposit is entirely refundable. Now, a buyer should look at a real estate transaction and look at one part of it being with contingencies and the other part being without contingencies, because once those contingencies are removed, it changes everything. It makes the earnest money deposit non-refundable. So if a buyer tries to back out, well, they have no contingency, which is just a provision in the agreement that allows them to back out without breaching the contract. Now, it's important to note that a contingency doesn't just magically expire and disappear. It must be removed in writing. A buyer must send a CR form, contingency removal form, to the seller stating that they're removing the contingencies. Only then does the deposit become non-refundable. Now, once that happens, the buyer can't back out and the buyer must close escrow. If they don't, they will very likely lose their deposit. The seller can take their deposit at that point. Now, given that contingencies don't automatically expire, the seller must enforce punctuality, because a seller, in theory, could wait and not push the buyer to remove contingencies, and the buyer may not be motivated. Sometimes buyers don't remove contingencies until they're asked because they're waiting for some sort of thing on their end, like let's say a loan approval. Their lender might be telling them, I need more time. I can't get you your loan approval just yet. Just give me a few more days. I'm working on it. I'm so close. And then the buyer then asks the seller for more time or tells the seller, I need a couple more days to remove contingencies. We're almost there with the loan. And this can go on. And I've seen it go on because sellers are so committed in a transaction. They've invested weeks with this same buyer. They don't want to start over and redo everything and try to pick up with a new buyer and have all the time frames start back at zero and reset. So sellers sometimes are generous with extensions, not realizing that as long as the contingency is still outstanding, that buyer can back out at any time. And I've seen scenarios where the parties might be 40 days in escrow and a buyer realizes only then that they can't get a loan. Of course, the buyer's disappointed. Of course, the buyer wanted to purchase the property, but they couldn't simply because they just couldn't obtain financing. So the buyer then sends a cancellation to the seller, and the seller feels very angry because they feel like they've been generous and understanding and giving extensions, and now the buyer, 40 days into an escrow, has decided to cancel. So of course the seller wants a deposit. The seller feels like they should be compensated for it. Here's a problem. They can't because contingencies weren't removed. That must happen in order for the seller to get the deposit. So a seller should absolutely enforce time periods, and I'll explain that on the seller side. In conclusion, a buyer should look at a transaction timeline in two different parts. One is before contingencies are removed, and the other is after contingencies are removed. Because if it's before they've been removed, the buyer can get their earnest money deposit back. If it's after, the buyer cannot back out without breaching the contract. Now, a seller has to sit and wait. Once they accept an offer, they're effectively stuck in a transaction. A seller can't change their mind 3 days into a transaction like a buyer can. Sometimes buyers just never even deliver an earnest money deposit because they change their mind right after an offer gets accepted. That doesn't happen with sellers. A seller accepts an offer and a seller's stuck. A seller accepts an offer and gets a backup offer that's much higher than what they just accepted. They're stuck. They're frustrated, they're disappointed. They can't get out of a transaction like a buyer can. They can't just cancel unless the buyer breaches. How does that happen? Well, a buyer needs to not perform a contractual provision, whatever is the action that they're supposed to perform in a certain time frame, and the seller can then send a notice perform and then cancel. Here's an example. 17 days have passed. The contingency period for the buyer is now over, but the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies in writing like they're supposed to. Well, a seller sends a notice to perform. demanding that the buyer remove contingencies. If the buyer doesn't, and within 2 days of receiving that notice, the seller can then cancel. Now, this happens fairly often, and the big question is, from a seller, if I cancel because the buyer didn't perform, maybe the buyer just disappeared, didn't remove contingencies, didn't answer phone calls or emails, just disappeared, and so the seller sends a notice to perform, still doesn't hear from the buyer, then the seller asks, can I keep the buyer's deposit? I sat here for 17 days waiting on the buyer just disappeared, I want their deposit. And the answer is no. If there are contingencies in place, the seller does not get the buyer's deposit. That's how it works. So a seller should look at a transaction timeline the same way a buyer does. The period before contingencies are removed and then the period after they're removed. Because if the buyer has removed contingencies and the seller sends a notice to perform, or even more likely, a demand to close, and the buyer doesn't perform the act that's requested, yes, in that case, the seller can keep the buyer's deposit. Now here's an example of that. Let's say the buyer has removed contingencies and now it's closing time, but for whatever reason, the buyer can't close. The buyer isn't showing up or delivering their proceeds needed to close, their funds needed to close to escrow. So what does the seller do? Well, remember how we use a notice to perform for the seller if the buyer's not behaving, if the buyer's not removing their contingencies, or if the buyer doesn't deliver their earnest money deposit to escrow? The notice to perform is the seller's tool. Well, at the end, a seller sends a demand to close, which is basically the same thing as the notice to perform, but it pertains to closing. And there's a 3-day waiting period for the buyer to perform rather than a 2-day period. That's the difference between those two forms. One is for closing at the end of the escrow. The other one is for enforcing a contractual action during the escrow. So at the end of the escrow, the seller sends a demand to close. Well, let's say the buyer doesn't close. Then what happens? The seller waits 3 days, the seller cancels. The seller can then seek to keep the buyer's deposit. Why? Because contingencies have been removed. That's what it all comes down to. Are there contingencies protecting the buyer's deposit? Are there contingencies in place that allow the buyer to back out? That's the question for the buyer and the seller, because a buyer should always be thinking that so they can diligently proceed with the transaction and not remove contingencies until they know that their loan is secure and that the appraisals come in, or that they've done all the inspections and investigations to their satisfaction. Because once it's removed, their deposit is non-refundable. And if they can't close, they're going to lose it. And a seller should be thinking about the same timelines, because they should know that they're going to be sitting there waiting, sitting on their hands during these inspection periods, during these contingency periods, knowing that they will not get a earnest money deposit if the buyer backs out. And they need to be enforcing these timelines so that if they go beyond the inspection or the contingency periods and the seller waits to the very end and the buyer doesn't perform, that's when a seller should send a demand to close that demands the buyer close within 3 days of receiving that notice, or the seller can terminate the transaction, carry on with a new backup buyer, and seek to keep the buyer's earnest money deposit. That's how cancellations work. The buyer needs to have a contingency to cancel. The seller needs to give notice when a buyer's not performing in order to cancel. Those are the two actions that need to happen for each party. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching.